Shulk and Zanza are the two most important characters to the narrative of Xenoblade Chronicles, both in terms of the literal plot and in terms of the greater themes of the story. They are perfect mirrors of each other, both facing major issues with their identity and their ability to understand other people, until Zanza spirals while Shulk grows. I feel like the two are best looked at together, as their influence on each other as well as the way they work as foils is hard to ignore. And yet, if my life depended on finding 5 other people talking about Zanza, I'm gonna be honest, I don't think I would make it. He's one of those characters who relies almost fully on the subtext of a few specific lines, leading a lot of people to see him as incredibly shallow or shoehorned in. If you were among the people who felt underwhelmed by Zanza, confused about the symbolism conveyed by him and Shulk, or if you just wanted to see an in-depth exploration of either of these characters, then hello. I'm Phantom Height, and as someone who studied game design and psychology, it's basically my job to overthink these things. Today, I will be subjecting you to a full analysis of Shulk, Zanza, and the greater messages these two explore about personal development. I've also already posted a full hour-long thematic analysis of Xenoblade 1, which introduced some of what I'll be talking about, so check that out if you're interested. That aside, let's begin. In order to set the groundwork, I want to talk about the characters in isolation first, beginning with Shulk. Shulk is a character who starts out incredibly flawed. For the first part of the story, his major issues are his anxiety and his difficulty connecting with people, which are pretty deeply tied to each other. For the latter, it's established pretty quickly that while book-smart, Shulk is not emotionally intelligent and has trouble understanding others and taking initiative with them. A lot of these problems are enabled by his anxiety, but he also struggles with theory of mind, which means he can't always process that other people's thoughts and experiences differ from his own. Seeing as a major theme in the game is learning to understand other people, it makes sense to have a protagonist who starts off with somewhat impaired empathy. Take for example when Rein swings the Monado at Fiora. This is a moment that terrifies Fiora, with her believing she is in legitimate danger and being quite shaken up after it happens. Rein immediately acknowledges her distress, sprinting to check up on her and provide emotional support. However, Shulk completely ignores her and complains about how one of his machines broke, somewhat rudely remarking that she's not hurt when this reaction upsets her. From his perspective, he knew Fiora wasn't in real danger, so he can't comprehend why his behavior is hurtful and thinks it's obvious why he cared more about his equipment than her. He doesn't realize that she doesn't have the same knowledge or experience as him, which leads to miscommunication and hurt feelings. I can also point to times like Shulk very aggressively dismissing Lady Maineth on Fallen Arm, before ever asking Fiora how she felt about her. He was angry at Maineth for possessing Fiora, so he assumes Fiora is too and concludes that Maineth took her by force and needs to stay gone. His thinking is very black and white, as he never really asks questions like why or how, instead jumping to extreme conclusions and then projecting them onto others. Him not separating his own opinions from others also explains a lot of his behavior in heart-to-hearts, such as the one where he, to everyone else's horror, starts cluelessly gifting Ricky machine parts. This trait is something that isn't really harmful on this scale, but can take multiple routes. A person can learn to develop higher empathy as they get older through asking people more questions, not acting off rationalizations, focusing on open conversation, and so on, but again, it is something that is learned and takes time. Having been influenced negatively more than positively due to both Zanza and his trauma from Colony 9, Shulk for a while gets worse and stays closed off, and his projection starts to become harmful in more serious situations. In Magna Forest, Melia goes through a somewhat similar loss to Shulk. She failed to protect her companions when fighting the Telethia, and helplessly watched them pass away. The difference between the two, though, is that Melia never felt hateful about it. She was fighting the Telethia because it was an assigned task to her to prove her worth as a ruler, and she was content to return home and apologize to her companions' families as soon as she thought she couldn't actually beat it. Her reaction is one of sadness, but Shulk doesn't realize that. In his experience with losing Fiora, he felt rage and a desire for vengeance, so he projects that mindset onto Melia when seeing her go through a comparable situation. He talks about how he understands Melia's desire for revenge, and he pushes her to physically seek it out even though she never expressed feeling that way. Then, at Prison Island, when Melia protests against Zanza's deal to upgrade the Monado, Shulk starts complaining about how Melia of all people should understand why they should accept it. After all, if she had felt the same desire for revenge as him, she would never turn down the power to achieve it. But of course, she didn't feel that way. Shulk was cutting off and dismissing her real feelings in favor of his own interpretation of her. With the loss of Saurian shortly after, Melia again starts showing hesitation and discomfort, until Shulk talks about how she can think about her people later and needs to focus on revenge right now. He states that she is an individual and she cannot let the Mechon get away with their actions. It's ironic. He's trying to empower her individuality, but he just ends up robbing her of it. As mentioned, Shulk also struggles with initiative. Even in Colony 9, his friends are always the ones seeking him out while he's just off on his own, probably pondering the Monado like a nerd. But the point is, it's never the other way around, and Shulk never learning to take initiative burns him when the stakes are higher. When he gets visions, he is too scared to bring them up to anyone. He instead starts lagging behind in groups as a sort of cry for help, waiting for people to ask what's wrong and bring the conversation to him. And even when they do, he's still scared to open up, usually saying it's nothing until he has been repeatedly pressed for information. He states in a heart-to-heart that he thinks all he ever accomplishes is waiting for everyone to save him, which is exactly what he's doing by acting this way. He doesn't see the people in front of him, just as he doesn't really understand them. He sees his version of them and how he thinks they will act instead of how they actually are. And visions are a very literal metaphor for this sort of tunnel vision mindset. As soon as Shulk has glimpsed the future, that event is no longer certain. There are infinite possibilities for how it could actually go, but Shulk for a while stays fixated on the worst case scenario and doesn't realize that other people can differ from his expectations of them if he gives them the chance. He instead puts the pressure on himself to control the outcome alone. Supported by his underdeveloped empathy, the core driving motivation for Shulk's negative choices is fear. He's afraid to be the bearer of bad news, afraid of losing the people he cares about, afraid of the infinite possibilities the future holds. He is scared of experiencing further pain and vulnerability after the traumatic attack on Colony 9, which was yet another time where he had been left paralyzed and unable to act. His fear makes the very possibilities he is afraid of even more likely. It holds him back from actually growing or developing as a person, leading him to focus on unhealthy distractions like revenge instead. None of his behavior is malicious, as he is an incredibly compassionate person who is genuinely just trying to get by and help others to the best of his ability. It is intense fear, trauma, and the stunted emotional development resulting from it that warps his approach to doing so. It's why his character can be so kind and warm, despite how negative his actions sound when described out loud. And as you may have guessed, there is one object at the very center of all of this, encouraging Shulk to remain stuck. That being, of course, the Monado. The thing about the Monado is that it enables the wielder to respond to fear by exerting control. If something bad is going to happen, you'll get a vision warning you, and you can just focus on preventing it. There are fewer what-ifs to worry about, because you actually have the foresight to act upon them. Another major part of this is that the Monado's power is limited. It isn't just smooth sailing after you get a vision, because visions are not actually showing the future. I talked about this in my last video, but as soon as Shulk knows not to act the same way he did in a vision, he is back to square one of having no idea what is going to happen. He therefore becomes fixated on the worst case scenario he was shown, but never receives a guarantee of avoiding it. It's a fake way out that in reality just keeps him anxious and fuels obsessive thoughts of control, but it is one that he continues to grow reliant on. In both the main story and in Heart to Hearts, Shulk frequently brings up how he wishes he could see things just a little more clearly. He focuses on how he can't save everyone, and is constantly frustrated by the limitations of his power. And so, he falls into a loop of wanting more and more of that power. It's why Zanza has such an easy time manipulating Shulk into freeing him at Prison Island, even when other characters knew something was up. The Monado is ever so slowly pushing him toward the pursuit of full control, which is a pursuit that destroys one's sense of self, something that Zanza's possession is an allegory for. Your thoughts become a plan to create an outcome, and your actions become an act to sustain that outcome. You don't have time to be open with other people, as you become more focused on influencing them than connecting with them. You don't have time for yourself, you're living in survival mode, desperately trying to pull the strings in your favor. The Monado, quite literally in this case, turns Shulk into a shell of a person, paralyzed by fear, the future, and the desire to protect himself from it. One might even say to him that,
"You aren't here! Not anymore!"
If Shulk is someone taking the first few steps on the path to losing himself, Zanza is someone who has run at least 47 laps around that path. My last video discussed how the overall game is about perspective and developing authenticity, so naturally the main villain is a character who failed to do so. Even just looking into his eyes, you can see just how jaded he has become. though he wasn't always like that, and I think it's important to focus on why. As confirmed by Alvis, Zanza's core motivation was a desire for friendship. He was deeply lonely in the new world and wanted company. We can see that his attempt at such was genuine, as he once willingly held the hand of the Mechonis, allowing the people of both Titans to live in peace and grow together. He would have existed alongside everyone, but we can also infer that he doesn't really understand what friendship is or how to forge a connection. His approach to it appears to be more, how can I get this person to be my friend, as opposed to, how can I get to know this person? That's why we see his only relationships being ones where he is offering immortality and power to people in exchange for their devotion instead of actually talking to them. It's kind of like becoming rich so people will befriend you, and then expecting those connections to actually make you feel less lonely instead of causing you to be used. The important part about this approach, though, is that it centers Zanza. He might think he is being generous or magnanimous, but at the end of the day, he is taking advantage of a power imbalance in the form of divine gift-giving to get people to like and serve him. There is no chemistry or connection, and it is unlikely that either him or his friends know much about each other at all. Even with Dixon, the person who has known Zanza the longest of anyone, it's pretty clear how shallow their relationship is. Dixon doesn't actually care about Zanza and is just following the strongest side out of fear and personal gain. He even directly states that he's fine with either Shulk or Zanza winning, and Zanza barely even reacts when he dies. That's a pretty depressing bar for what is likely Zanza's best relationship, especially considering his main driving motivation was to make friends. I don't believe that Zanza is self-aware about his methods being flawed, as again, we know he genuinely wanted connection, and he also appears surprised that people aren't appreciative of him. We don't get to see his demeanor in the past, but even after becoming fully jaded, his lack of awareness is still so high that everything he says feels almost sarcastic. He starts thanking Shulk after realizing Shulk helped him obtain a second Monado, and offers to forgive him for his alleged betrayal. Even when characters like Ryan mock him for speaking this way, he obliviously takes it literally and talks about how yes, he does want to give Shulk a reward. He doesn't even seem to realize that the reward of being his next vessel in itself is insulting, and instead starts talking about the benefits and how they could attain peace. When Melia responds by asking if he really just considers them his playthings, he is confused at the word choice of playthings and asks what she's talking about, even stating that it's regrettable that Shulk doesn't want him around anymore. He is completely blind to the experiences of other people or any of the harm he is causing because he is too self-absorbed to have learned how to see a perspective other than his own. We can apply this mindset to Zanza's prior, more sane and cooperative self from when he withheld peace to see why he went from passively apathetic to actively harmful. As time went on, both his and Mainet's people evolved, and they started speaking of leaving their titans. The cross between cultures led to many inhabitants of the Bionis living on the Mechonis, as well as many inhabitants of the Mechonis living on the Bionis. The greatest of dreamers even began to speak of leaving behind their world entirely. This development threatened Zanza, as each person not returned to the Bionis meant more and more of his life force being depleted. Many of these people still loved and respected Maineth, but they slowly forgot about Zanza. After all, Zanza didn't understand or connect with anyone to begin with. Unlike Maineth, he is never depicted as having a real presence in the area of peace, as there's just not a single person he meaningfully impacted in a positive way to tell the story. It is likely that he just spent his time on Prison Island, never taking initiative, and eventually, after years of stasis, years of not growing or taking action, his time ran out. Zanza created life out of his feelings of loneliness, but his people would eventually evolve and leave him behind, letting him slowly fade out of existence before he ever made a real friend. If you think that this idea is terrifying, Zanza would agree. He feared this fate so much that he put the entire world into a perpetual cycle of destruction and recreation, just so that his people would never be able to develop enough to abandon him again. Had this not been his true motivation, it would have been easy for him to just stop bestowing sentience, as he never would have had to worry about this happening. But as Alvis told us, Zanza was lonely. He wanted real connection with real people, and forging those connections is something that takes effort, empathy, risk, and vulnerability. It requires things that Zanza fundamentally didn't understand, things he failed to learn before and even after it was too late, and so he began to seek control instead. He began to force people to stay by resetting their progress when they left. If Xenoblade is about learning to live authentically, Zanza is what stops the characters from doing so. It's emblematic of an abusive relationship, where Zanza drags others down with him because he hasn't grown, and he knows that anyone who actually does grow will reach the conclusion that they should leave him. The ones who don't leave him are the ones that share his toxic mindset, such as Dixon, who said that he never needed to feel fear when under Zanza. Alongside the cycle of destruction and recreation, the passage of fate is also a pretty literal metaphor for all of this, as it is basically a fancy way of saying Zanza's manipulation. It is literally his vision of the world, the outcome that will occur if no one manages to escape his control. He's preventing his own pain and demise by robbing others of free will, centering the world around himself because he has no idea how to face reality. It is pretty clear that Shulk and Zanza are closely tied. We know that Zanza resided within Shulk up until Makana's core, strongly influencing his behavior, and the two characters also look incredibly similar. Even the name Shulk itself is similar to the result of spelling Klaus, Zanza's original name, backwards, and the character flaws I described are the same, only varying in intensity. But how much of Shulk's behavior actually was because of Zanza? Can we just attribute all of Shulk's anger and harmful behavior to Zanza as a result of the possession? I think the best way to describe the dynamic between these two would be that of host and parasite. For the entire main story, Shulk has complete agency and is in full physical control of every single one of his actions. This is why he uses the Monado to begin with, as he is the only person the Monado never physically controls. However, Zanza influences him, both through using the Monado's visions to enable anxiety paralysis, and through Zanza existing as a second voice inside Shulk's head. We see Shulk mention this voice in Colony 9, and eventually hear it directly at Makana's core. However, that voice being Zanza's doesn't mean that Shulk never aligned with any of the ideas it introduced, as it takes a certain level of like-mindedness for him to actually trust and act upon Zanza's voice. Put simply, you probably won't decide your entire purpose in life is revenge over a random intrusive thought. At least, I would hope not. But anyway, the general idea is that Zanza reinforces Shulk's fears, making him more likely to act upon them and therefore become more similar to Zanza over time naturally. He is not a puppet master, he is an enabler focused on destroying his victim's sense of self. Throughout the game, the idea of Shulk becoming Zanza is repeatedly brought up. It makes enough sense given their similar flaws and Zanza's gradual manipulation, but the important part here is that to become Zanza is to lose yourself to fear. It is to forego living an authentic life out of this fear, and to resort to anxiously trying to control everything instead, which is something that Shulk is disposed to. Similar to Zanza, he has a hard time understanding people and taking initiative, and he has suffered a devastating loss that he actively blames himself for. These experiences lead to overwhelming fear and regret, two things that Zanza's Monado promises to get rid of. I think anyone who has experienced a major loss can understand why someone would be drawn to Zanza's Monado, hence why a genuinely well-meaning person like Shulk is shown as an example. If you were to lose someone deeply important to you, whether that be through death or through abandonment, would you not wish to change it? To put all of the what-ifs to rest? To ensure that nothing like that could happen again? Those are the thoughts that the Monado's visions take advantage of. They give you that second chance, that little bit of foresight that could have potentially changed everything. Or at least, that's what they promise to do. In reality, the uncertainty is still there, and the fact that that's even true for a god like Zanza means it's true no matter how far you go. It's a metaphor for sitting back and obsessively trying to control a future you don't want to face, even at the cost of your entire person. As Shulk stated in his dream, he reached out for that piece of scrap metal, the Monado, before the ground consumed him, losing himself fully as Zanza watched from above, eager to take control. You might notice that for the majority of Xenoblade Chronicles, Egil will not refer to Shulk by name. It is one of the many ways the game plays with Shulk's sense of self. In early scenes, Egil either calls him the Homs with the Monado or the boy. In their first direct encounter, he simply calls him Monado. In their following encounters, he will only refer to him as heir to the Monado. And this is noticeably not mutual, as Egil is introduced by name multiple times just for it to not be reciprocated. Egil speaks this way because he understands how Zanza and the Monado function, and he isn't biased enough towards Shulk to dismiss his flaws the way that the main party and the player might. He saw Zanza manipulate Arglas, and now he sees what looks to be another Monado wielder repeating history. He sees the Shulk that is afraid, the Shulk that obtained the Monado to eliminate that fear by destroying the Mechonis. He sees the Shulk that is projecting this view onto others and pushing them to seek revenge with him. He sees a Shulk that looks exactly like another Zanza. However, there is one key difference this time. At the end of the day, everything comes down to relationships. Shulk has people he genuinely cares about who he is willing to put before anything else, including his fears. And in this case, I'm talking about Fiora. Fiora is the sole reason that Shulk changes his mind about everything. Up until the moment he found out she was alive, he was angry and dysregulated, swinging his sword wildly and screaming at the Mechon. He went as far as to free Zanza despite knowing that the High Entia had years of history behind why they sealed him away, and it was just because he wanted more destructive power. However, seeing Fiora as a Mechon was the wake-up call that forced him to accept that there was more to the situation. It breaks all of the preconceived ideas he had been storing in his head about the Mechonis, as there is finally physical proof right in front of him that his entire ideology is wrong. This entire nation he viewed as a lifeless threat is made up of real people, people who he has absolutely no understanding of, people he loves and cares about, and he is forced to accept that. It pushes him to finally stop acting off raw emotions and start to learn empathy and further introspection. The first step in this process is that Shulk starts to actually define his own ideals. In the past, he was unable to express empathy properly because he did not have a very defined sense of self. I mean, he of course knew his own feelings and views, but he couldn't always separate them from other people. Everything got muddied together and he didn't really understand where his own values ended and where others' values began, which is why he naturally assumed people felt the same way as him and projected his feelings onto them like with Melia. Even in cases where this wasn't possible, such as with Dunban who had been very clear about his differences, Shulk would just state that he didn't understand and leave it at that. However, Prison Island prompts him to actually start thinking more inwardly. We see him take a back seat during Valak Mountain, and then at Sword Valley, all of these thoughts result in his choice to stop fighting the Mechon and focus on learning about their history and motivations first. It's the first time he makes a choice by himself that is against the ideologies of both his friends and of Zanza, and it's one he made based on his own introspection and values. It is irrefutable proof of him finally having a will of his own, as well as the initiative to act on it. Shulk acting outside of Zanza's will marks his escape from the passage of fate, which is reflected in the kinds of visions he starts to receive. Shulk mentions that his visions slowly stop coming from Zanza's Monado, and are more tied to himself and his own capabilities. As a result of this change, the content of visions has a major shift as well. While many visions before Prison Island were based around demonizing the Mechonis and seeking revenge, many visions after Prison Island depict Mechon in danger and prompt you to try to save them. It matches Shulk's shifting ideals as well as his slow escape from Zanza. While Zanza wants to claim Maynard's Monado and create a world that is peaceful due to people being forced to stay with him, Shulk is the one who actually wants to learn about the different kinds of people to find an authentic path to peace instead. Another important piece is that Shulk's developing mind does not mean that he is suddenly fully empathetic or always able to act in ideal accordance with his values. In fact, some of the examples I brought up, like his harsh black and white thinking about Lady Mayneth, happen right after Sword Valley. His progress is gradual, and he never really becomes perfect at understanding people either. Take for example when he tries to make Charla a new weapon despite her using Gatto's old rifle for sentimental purposes. It shows that Shulk still has an inherent problem of seeing other people's perspectives, no matter how much he grows. However, the party members accept this flaw and are happy to explain things to him, and then, in more serious scenes, he learns to push himself to prioritize asking more questions instead of operating off of these natural assumptions. It makes it clear that Shulk's growing empathy is not a sudden natural shift, but an active choice that requires conscious thought and effort on his part. It requires a will of his own, and more importantly, the will to be better. Something I want to highlight is that when Shulk and Fiora reunite, Shulk focuses on the idea of wanting no more regrets. It might be a simple line, but it's one that really encompasses the main ideas behind he and Zanza's characters, as well as the themes of the game itself. Zanza had stood idly by, never properly talking to or learning to understand another soul before his time ran out, leading him to rely on manipulation to escape the resulting regrets. Shulk was falling into a similar mindset, where he would focus on the Monado, the future, and how to escape repeated pain by controlling it, but it's this moment with Fiora that he hints at a new solution. Instead of using underhanded and unhealthy tactics, Shulk's new concept of no more regrets is one where he decides to use his agency to take action. He wants to live in the moment so that he won't leave anything for himself to regret in the first place. He wants to be with his loved ones and spend every moment being his most authentic self, so that, at the end of the day, he can be at peace knowing that he did the best he could. Do keep this idea in mind for when I discuss the ending. Agniratha and Mechonis Core are the payoff for all of the ideas from this section. It solidifies Shulk's commitment to individuality. After all of the pain, suffering, and feelings of vengeance, Shulk is face to face with the person who set everything into motion, the person who took Fiora and caused him more agony than anyone else. But at this moment, all he can say is, "I didn't come to fight. I just want to know something." He is no longer projecting, he is leaving himself open and allowing even the one person he has every right to hate and assume the worst of the chance to talk. Not even just allowing it, but genuinely asking it after taking the time to try to understand his history and perspective through research on his own time. It is a striking difference from Zanza, and it's one that forces Egil to recognize that Shulk is his own person. Of course, the encounter still ends up leading to a battle, but it also leads to Egil referring to Shulk by name for the very first time in the entire game. He quickly corrects himself and calls Shulk Zanza though, as at the end of the day, the fact that they still ended up fighting meant that Shulk's will had not yet been strong enough to stop Zanza's outcome from occurring. At least, not until Mechonis Core. Oh, Mechonis Core, the culmination of everything. Shulk has not only fully committed to his more peaceful values, but he also uses his strength strictly in pursuit of them. When he stands above Egil, ready to strike the final blow, he hears Zanza's taunts, telling him he wants revenge and allowing us to finally understand what his mind sounds like. But this time, Shulk has taken the time to define his own ideals. They are no longer muddied with those of others. Instead of seeing Zanza as an extension of his person, instead of talking about the other version of himself in his head again, all he can say is, "That voice. Who is that?" After a lifetime of no boundaries, he has found enough confidence in himself to separate his identity from that of everyone who has impacted him, even someone as manipulative and controlling as Zanza. When Egil speaks to him about future peace, he specifically states that he saw how well Shulk retained a sense of self. Again, Egil doesn't know Shulk personally. He can't recognize Shulk's personality and has spent a lifetime seeing Zanza within him after watching Arglis act the same way. It is simply the idea of Shulk having a sense of self whatsoever that convinces him that Shulk is different, further solidifying that Zanza is defined by the concept of identity loss. And we see this idea come to full fruition as Zanza is finally prompted to intervene. Throughout all of his scenes, Zanza has little to say beyond thoughts of control and power. He's focused purely on the goal of wanting Manus Monado, as acquiring it will allow him to forego the need to use people as vessels, and therefore create an artificially peaceful world centered around himself. However, the key word here is artificially. As I mentioned before, Zanza never learned to understand himself or others. Even if he succeeded in his goal, he would never feel fulfilled or less lonely. He would just continue to be a control freak, anxiously focused on making sure everything goes his way. He was once a scientist so passionate, talented, and ambitious that he had literally changed the world, but his own fears, insecurity, and difficulty connecting with people broke him down until he became nothing but a manipulative vessel for escapism, desperate to remain in his own world. If I wasn't pretentious enough for you yet, I now want to talk about color theory before moving on to direct symbols. For the designs most tied to Zanza's identity, Zanza is consistently depicted with white and yellow. As a scientist, he wore a pure white coat, with the only yellow being his hair. As a god, he still wears white robes, but the yellow have slowly consumed his design, covering his outfit while also manifesting in wings and a halo. While white is depicted with purity and innocence, yellow is a much more complicated color symbolically. In small amounts, it is considered uplifting and fosters hope and creativity, which reflects Zanza's identity as Klaus. While arguably a bit too ambitious, he is a scientist with relatively pure intent, using his creativity and intellect out of hope to push the world to its next stage. It fits the symbolism of having white with bits of yellow, however, there is a lot more to talk about with his god form. I said that yellow is a positive color in small amounts, but Overuse of highly saturated yellow is found to be overstimulating and lead to stress and emotional fragility. Myth or not, a significant amount of sources claim that overly yellow rooms can enable babies to cry and couples to argue more, and various media such as Charlotte Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper portray it as something that causes a character to become obsessive to the point of insanity. It fits Zanza perfectly, as he is a character that is insane not out of evil, but out of overwhelming neuroticism and fear, his eons of addictively pursuing control to alleviate a loneliness that never goes away have broken him down, leading to a point where there is little left of him, reflected by his white design becoming consumed by yellow. Emotional instability, obsessive thoughts, and the resulting behavior overtakes purity, creativity, and good intent. The other main symbol that Zanza is associated with is that of a prison. The Monado itself has already been consistently tied to prison, as shown by it constantly being sealed away and even causing Shulk to become imprisoned by the High Entia. But the symbolism with Zanza goes further. The core location that Zanza as a character is tied to is Prison Island, with him spending his time there before and after the war, while also using it for his personal ceremonies. However, Prison Island itself isn't really a conventional prison. As far as we know, the only person to ever actually be in prison there is Zanza himself. The actual cultures of the Bionis hold prisoners in other ways, as shown by Shulk earlier. However, Zanza willingly stays in and returns to his own prison on a daily basis. The symbol gets incorporated into his actual design as well. When Zanza confronts the party at Makana's core, he gains wings and a halo. Wings, as you probably know, are typically associated with freedom and power, while halos are tied to divinity. But there's more going on here. Zanza's wings are made of the exact same color and shapes as the symbols on Prison Island. His wings are literally the same as the chains that bound him. It represents the entire ideology conveyed by his Monado, which I stated to be an illusion of freedom and control that in reality only serves to keep its wielder stuck. His halo ties this idea to his godhood, which fits considering the fact that the limitations of his divine power are what pushed him to become worse in the first place. He is a willing prisoner of his own mind, who remains bound by the false promise of control being the key to freedom. The final areas of the game are when the symbolism really hits the fan. Prison Island sinks into the Bionis itself, and the party moves to access it by navigating the Bionis interior. The final destination of this region is the heart of the Bionis, the heart of Zanza. Upon defeating Lorithia, it is from this location that the characters can finally return to Prison Island. I want to make my point here very clear. You access Zanza's personal prison by going to Zanza's heart. And then within that prison, you find him hidden away in memory space, as the regrets making up his memory bind him. The heart of the Bionis is a prison, because that's what Zanza willingly lives in and subjects all of his people to. While Shulk is able to detach from the Monado's mental prison and focus on personal development, Zanza remains in a permanent stasis. The closing sequence ties everything together, painting one final image to solidify the foil between Shulk and Zanza, while also exploring the providence of divinity and the human nature of Zanza's fears. I discussed earlier that you can tell from Zanza's words how oblivious he is. He is stuck in his own vision of the world, and is so drunk on his seemingly infinite power that he can't process the idea that his vision ending means his demise. Alvis states that this is the providence of the world, and that even someone as strong as Zanza is restricted to the power level determined by said providence, which is not unlimited. To explain what providence is, I want to tie it back to some of my earlier points. I've talked a lot about how control is inherently a limited pursuit in this world, as no matter how much power one obtains, it will never be enough to fully escape uncertainty. Restrictions based on providence are the literal manifestation for this limit, and they highlight the fact that sentient life does not want to be controlled. It limits Zanza's power to the extent to which people can stand against him. Put simply, providence is defined by the agency of other beings, the strength of their will to fight back. Zanza can try as hard as he wants to manipulate everyone into staying with him, but they will eventually have enough and try to escape, therefore signifying the beginning of his downfall. That brings me into my next point, which is that the last connecting dot to complete Xenoblade's thematic framework is agency. Uncertainty leads to a cycle of fear and control, but that cycle can be broken by learning and growing enough to find your own agency. That's exactly what the game means by saying Shulk needs to find his own Monado. He needs to find the agency to be himself and build a better future with his own hands, which is why the strength of his will to do so is constantly being tested by Alvis to determine providence. Shulk could have easily remained paralyzed in fear, closing himself off fully and continuing to pull strings to get by. He could have become like Zanza, someone who has no real agency, connections, or presence in his life despite having all the control in the world. But he didn't. He decided to throw away Zanza's Minato and live with no more regrets, to put himself out there and deal with the ups and downs of life so that at the end of the day, he doesn't have to be haunted by the what-ifs. Shulk has healed from his trauma and grown into the best version of himself in spite of Zanza's enablement, leading the old god to be defeated by the new god that he himself created. The last thing I want to talk about is Shulk's final exchange with Alvis. In it, Shulk learns Zanza's true motivations and states that perhaps it would have been possible to coexist with him. Alvis confirms this, but states that the time has now passed. This line is important to me, because it highlights the fact that Zanza is more than pure evil for the sake of evil. He wanted friendship and could have possibly at some point in his life changed. He isn't a character that can be resonated with because he is some tragic hero who tried to save the world and went wrong, or because he had a depressing past that changed him forever. He is a character who simply faces the consequences of his actions. He never saw past his own vision, never grew, never developed in any way, and when he got burned for that, he fell into a fear so strong he resorted to control as a means to escape his own regrets. Change and growth are not always easy, especially for someone with no one in their life, and Zanza doesn't even need the slightest hint of a moral justification or troubled backstory to convey that. I honestly prefer it this way, as it taps into a very real fear that anyone can experience, and it disrupts the misconception that trauma and mental health issues are what lead to someone becoming a bad person. Your character is defined by your own actions, your agency, as Shulk managed to figure himself out and create a healthier future in a world where Zanza failed and dragged others down with them. For those of you who made it to the end, I once again really appreciate it. If you've been following me, you may know that these two are my favorite characters in the franchise, as well as my favorite characters in general alongside a certain other individual. I really hope that you were able to enjoy the analysis and maybe even find something new to appreciate. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you showed your support, as I love reading through everyone's comments and I will be posting a lot more analysis content if you want to subscribe. For now though, thanks so much again and do take care of yourself.